Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we're going to be talking about organizational behavior in a global context. I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation. Good. So there are a handful of different objectives, knowledge objectives that we're going to talk to today. This is chapter 3, of course, from your textbook. So the first one is defining globalization and discussing the forces that influence this phenomenon. Then we're going to talk about the 3 different types of international involvement by associates and managers and describe the problems that can arise with each of those, which will be very relevant because after business school, you guys are going to talk about how to involve international involvement by associates and managers, how that varies across different firms and how different firms handle the environment. The fourth objective is that we're going to describe high involvement management in the international arena, emphasizing the adaptation of this management approach to different cultures, right? So this book and this course really focuses a lot on how we can get managers to be highly involved in their day-to-day activities, because that provides for a more efficient environment and more greater chance for competitive advantage against other firms. And the last objective is to identify and explain the key ethical issues in an international business, which come up quite often. Let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. First, let's define what is globalization, right? This is a trend toward a unified global economy where national borders mean relatively little, right? This is waking up, putting on your shoes that were made in China, working for a firm that maybe is headquartered in France, and then finishing your day by making a reservation for an airplane ticket to go to El Salvador, right? So everything is interconnected, and today, we don't just work within one individual country or live with one individual country. Everything is connected. And I like to think of globalization in 3 different parts. The first one being direct foreign investment. So that's money coming from developed countries into less developed countries. Also importing and exporting goods. And the last piece of globalization that I think of is where undeveloped countries expect to be more larger economies than the US, right? So China is expected to be the largest economy in coming years, and India is expected to be the third largest economy in coming years. So those are things to watch out for, right? Because the US was the largest economy for a very, very long time, but that is about to change. So that's again why globalization is so important. Let's hop into culture. What is culture? Here, the book defines it as shared values and assumptions that can govern acceptable behavior and thought patterns in a country. So there are 4 different parts to what I think of as culture here. The first one being that many fear that unique cultures will disappear over time, right? So especially in a country small like Switzerland, where my dad is from, right? They really try and hold on to that culture because it is such a small country, right? So they fear that very quickly there will be only McDonald's restaurants in Switzerland, right? Or there will be only watches made in China. So we want to, talk about a little bit in this chapter what that feels like to have globalization but still hold on to the local culture. The next thing is we talk about here in this chapter is labor exploitation, right? And so this is where we go abroad for cheaper labor, where countries have lower economic status. And so we can get graphic designers in Thailand for a quarter of the price, or we can get shoes made in China for a portion of what they would cost to be made here. So we're going to talk about that as well in this chapter, what that is. The third section of culture that I like to talk about here is the natural resource depletion, right? So the oil, right? That's what a lot of it boils down to, right? The US has not been able to find enough, create enough oil in the last few decades. And so we've had to go abroad to the Middle East for that. So again, this is a big part of what globalization is all about. And the last piece of culture, when we talk about this chapter, is the export of jobs to developing nations. So again, talking about those jobs going abroad, whether that be for cheaper labor or just for different values and different opportunities that they could have that they wouldn't get here in the US. So let's go ahead and hop into the next chapter. What are the opportunities and challenges of globalization? So let's talk about the challenges first, right? The first one are political risks. And so this is where a country potentially has a government or political system that is not as stable, right? So the big example here is, where governments potentially could take over the local business. So if you as an organization, as you as a CEO or manager is looking to invest in a particular country, you need to look and see if there are any political risks. This has happened in communist nations, right? And so the Czech Republic, Cuba. So in the past, people have been hesitant to invest in those countries in the chance that the communism would take over and envelop their business. So the Czech Republic, for example, is now stable from political risk for the most part, but that's something that has happened in the past. The next thing is an economic risk. So this is where the value in foreign currency can change very drastically and very quickly. I remember this from business school. I had a good friend who was from Argentina, and he had enrolled in business school here in the US in September from a family that would be able to pay for his education for the next 2 years. A couple months in, this was in 2003, the Argentinian economy drastically had a huge recession into a depression. And now no longer was the Argentinian currency as valued as high as it used to be. And so his credit cards got frozen. He had to rethink his financial strategy when it came to paying for business school. He had to really reevaluate if he could actually stay in the United States because now the Argentinian currency was completely devalued. So this happens again when we invest in other countries, right? Is that if the money that we're going to invest there, is that going to retain the value for the future? And the last challenge that we talk about in this chapter is a managerial risk, right? Are your managers going to be able to handle working abroad or working with companies abroad? So this comes down to language issues, right? Also tariffs and logistics. So does it really make sense for your organization or for your group to work abroad? Can you understand what the rules are abroad? A good example of this is Disney, going into Paris, right? Going into opening up a Euro Disney, right? They didn't necessarily anticipate all of those managerial risks when they went there, right? They had a lot of years of failure before Euro Disney truly became popular. One of the big things was they didn't understand the local culture, right? They didn't understand that the people in Europe like to all eat lunch typically around noon. And so the restaurants would be full at noon, but then empty in the morning and empty in the afternoon. That doesn't happen here in the US. Here in the US, we're a lot less formal about lunchtime. We kind of eat throughout the day. It's no problem to eat lunch at 2 or 3. And so the restaurants stay open. But in Euro Disney, they had an issue because they got flooded at noon and they couldn't handle the occupancy, the high occupancy. And so they had to then readjust how their restaurant business worked at Euro Disney. So that was a managerial risk that really hurt them because then they had a lot of people not wanting to come back to Euro Disney. So let's look at the opportunities. Why would you want to go abroad, right? The first one here being growth, right? You've maybe potentially outgrown the US. You have sold all the shoes that you need to sell in the US. Everybody has a pair of shoes. And now you want to see if the Germans need your shoes or if the Italians or the South Koreans would like your shoes. So it's a huge opportunity to sell things abroad. Right? Then also diversification of risk. This is a huge one, right? So what if the US economy were to fail or to go into recession and all of your products were being sold only here? You would have a problem. But if you were selling abroad and the Russian market, for example, continued to do well while the US market was failing or falling down, then you would be able to balance the two, right? So a really nice opportunity to diverse your risk. The next opportunity is economies of scale. And we saw this right in South Korea with Hyundai. They were able to create enough cars for all of South Korea that they could work with, but they then wanted to buy rubber in greater amounts. They wanted to buy their aluminum in greater amounts and get a lower price because they were able to buy larger portions. So they decided then to move forward and export their cars into the rest of the world. And now they could get their source materials at a lower cost. The last opportunity here is location advantages, right? And so this is coming back to lower labor costs and a specialized expertise. So again, being able to go abroad and get a graphic designer or somebody in a factory to put together your shoes for a lower price. And there's also expertise that is abroad that we might not necessarily have here in the US. So let's go ahead and hop into the next the next slide. So internationally focused jobs. What are those, and is that something you might want to partake in? So we're going to talk about first thriving on challenge. So if you're interested in an internationally focused job, you're really interested in an extra challenge, right? Because going abroad is not necessarily simple, right? There are going to be new hurdles, new challenges, things that you potentially haven't focused on before. But what's exciting is that you can have a geographically dispersed team. So what that means, if you have an international job, then you most likely will have people from India, from Germany, from Africa, all on your team. And that creates a lot of excitement for some people and a really intriguing or interesting aspect to a team. You're also going to rely heavily on electronically mediated communication, and this is what we spoke about in a previous chapter, virtual electronic teams, right? Because everybody's in a different place and in a different time zone, relying a lot on email and Zoom meetings is become a major part of how you do business every day. And so you're going to need to learn to manage that, and also potentially take calls with Russia at 11 o'clock at night, US time, California time, because it's their 9 a.m. The last piece of an internationally focused job is developing trust quickly. So this is what they talk about in the book called Swift Trust. And so how this works is that a manager needs to come in and mediate this, and get those team members to develop that trust. Because if we don't have that trust between team members, and people slack on their work, they don't necessarily show up for meetings, and the project is at a high risk of failure. So one of the first things that a manager wants to do is have the group connect and communicate a lot on task-related exchanges, because this is critical to help the members of the team to identify with the team, to really understand what it is that the objective is of the group and how they're going to accomplish those goals. So that's the first thing that we want to do, is have the team bond or communicate about these project-related issues. And then the manager can go into also supplementing that with 3 major areas. They want to provide training to the team members, right? So the team members understand how to communicate with the other team members who are not necessarily from their own culture. They also want to implement and develop a vision within the team so that everybody on the team is clear as to where they're headed and where they're going. And also the manager might want to implement some face-to-face meetings if that's possible. So that is another way to get the team to bond and to communicate and to have a more likeliness of a successful project. So now we're going to talk about learning about a counterpart's culture. So the first part is try not to identify another's culture too quickly, right? And so some people are shaped by more than one culture. And the example is that you might have a student in your class and she's Hispanic and she's talking about her Mexican heritage, but she's not necessarily completely Mexican 100%, right? She might be half Mexican, and it might be her other parent might be from Honduras. So yes, she knows a lot about Hispanic culture, but the Mexican culture and the Honduran culture are very, very different. So you don't want to generalize that she's potentially all Mexican, because she might not be. Good. The next thing we want to talk about is the being aware of a Western bias towards taking action, right? And so this is a Western thing where we want to move forward right away. So we want to come up with a decision. We want to come up with a solution very quickly. In the East, that's not necessarily the case. They might want to first talk about it and think about it before they come up with a solution, right? So if you go to Japan and you have a business meeting, it's very likely that you come out of that business meeting without some sort of resolution, that they want to go home, think about it, maybe talk to their colleagues. We'll talk about that later, how they want to, make sure that they have consensus within the group and with their higher ups and maybe with their family, whatever it might be. But they don't necessarily want to quickly come to a decision. So we want to be aware of our Western bias towards taking action. The third part of learning about a counterpart's culture is avoid formulating simple perceptions of others' culture's values. Right, so this is highly complex, and so right. So the example that I like to think about is when we think about the Mexican culture, right? You'll think that, oh, they're mostly Catholic, they're very family oriented, they typically have large families, but we're simplifying that, right? That the Mexican culture, that they're also very hard workers, right? Especially if they're from one of the big cities like Mexico City, um, that they can be very, very dedicated to their job at the same time. So we don't want to just always say, oh, the Mexicans are Catholic and they're into their family. It's complex, right? That it really we want to get to know the person as an individual and understand their personal values before we generalize. The next one is don't assume your values are the best for the organization, right? We'll talk about this a lot in this chapter too, right? That not necessarily saying that the Western values or the US values are the best, right? And so, for example, in India and in China, they are very loyal to their organizations, right? So they will stay with an organization for 20 or 30 years. And here in the US, that's not necessarily the case anymore. We're much more individualistic. And there's not to say that one is better than the other. That here in the US, we will stay with an organization for a couple of years, but we'll have no qualms about moving to another organization if we have better opportunities. So that's not necessarily the best way, that there is value in having an employee stay for a long, long time at an organization. The next one is recognizing that norms for interacting with outsiders may differ from those between compatriots. And so this is interesting. So if you feel that potentially you're working with a group of people from the Philippines and they all hang out with each other and you're not, as an American, not necessarily included, that we suggest hiring an advisor for you to understand what truly do you need to know about the Filipino culture, right? Is there a reason why they're excluding you? Is there something that you can better understand about that culture? And maybe that is just the way that they do business. So if you feel that you're being excluded, go ahead and hire an advisor to help you with that. The next one is paying close attention to unfolding dynamics. So this is all about listening carefully, right? So very easily we can kind of get into our own head and our own ideas about what the right way is to do business, but having a global mindset and being open to working with international environments is really listening as to what is going on with the group. Are there people that are not understanding what it is that you're communicating? Are there two other team members that are not understanding each other? Is there a gap in what the expectations are for the project, et cetera? So I like to think of this bullet point as just listening very carefully as to what's going on in your group. And the last bullet point here is to enter in exchanges with the goal of building relationships, right? Rather than competing. So as a manager and as someone who's involved in teams, that we want to go into this international environment with the idea that we're all in this together, and not necessarily that the US is better than any other country or that you are better than any other person, right? That we want to understand everybody for who they are and where they come from. Foreign job assignments, is this something that you want to do? right? So let's talk about what goes into being an expatriate. So this is an individual who leaves his or her home country to work in a foreign land. And a super exciting, in my opinion, opportunity. As I graduated business school, I'd say over 50% of my colleagues did this type of work. Many of them came from abroad because we were we are the top nation, the top school in the nation for international business. So a lot of students come there to study from abroad, and then they go back to their home country or they go back to another international country. Me personally, I've had 3 or 4 different expatriate opportunities, and it's been, for me, super interesting. I really enjoy getting to know other cultures, getting to know other people from other places, and understanding the business in a different way. But one of the things that we can experience when we go abroad is culture shock. And I think many of you have had this experience in your travel, right? The stress involving difficulties coping with the requirements of life in a new country, right? There's a new language, new food, new ways of doing things. So for the first couple of weeks or even first couple of years, we might be adjusting to how life is abroad. And the book also talks about reverse culture shock. So I too have experienced that, right? Going abroad, living there for a couple of years, and then coming back to my home country, coming back to the US where I was born. I had a hard time adjusting to things that I grew up with. The things like the messy roads, as I can think of, is like living in Switzerland and Germany. The roads are really clean. The trains are on time. Everything, the sidewalks are really just meticulous. And then coming back to the US, that's something I didn't recognize before I had left. Like, why is my car shaking when I drive through downtown Los Angeles, right? The roads are just a mess. And when I take my son for a walk on the sidewalk, why do we have to jump over all of these cracks in the sidewalk? And it's so dirty. And why do I have to even look out for these things? So yeah, so being aware of that and being, frustrated on both sides. And the last point of this slide is talking about ethnocentrism. So this is all about the belief that one's culture is better than others. And this is something that we obviously want to avoid, right? The US is not better than any other land. Okay, yes, the conveniences here are fantastic. We can go to the drugstore at 10 o'clock at night and it's on a Sunday and it's open. It's fantastic, but it's not necessarily better. Right? It's so nice that in Europe, the stores are closed on Sunday. We get a day of rest. So being able to appreciate both cultures and both sides of the living situation. Great. So what does it mean to train an expatriate? So this is, a lot for HR managers, right? What if you have a manager going abroad, what do you have to do? And if you are that manager going abroad, this is what is encouraged that you partake in. So the first thing is to convince the expatriate who's going abroad that it's super important, right? That before we go abroad, we think, oh, it's going to be easy. We, can function easily in our home country. We're excited for this opportunity. It's going to be so fun. It can be fun. It is going to be fun for sure, but there are going to be hurdles, right? They're going to be either going to speak a different language. You might have a hard time getting a train ticket. You might have a hard time finding the particular foods that you like to eat. So this particular training, they call it cross-cultural training is what they call it. There are professionals out there who will prepare you for the country that you're about to enter. And you want to make sure that not only do you train the manager who's going abroad, you need to train the whole entire family, because this portion of the chapter talks a lot about how if you're going abroad with your family, how your family needs to adjust nicely as well. Otherwise, the expatriate assignment will most likely be unsuccessful and the manager will need to come home. I've seen this time and time again, right? So someone goes abroad with their wife and she decides not to work when they get abroad because she doesn't have a work visa or she doesn't want to work. And she has a hard time fitting into the environment. And usually then they end up going home. Let's talk about the next one, pre-departure orientation. So all of this training and everything happens before you go. I know it's hard to make time as you're beginning to move and make these changes, but it's really important for these expatriates to have this training before they go. They also want to make sure they have some key cultural information. What are the major holidays? as we get into later in this chapter, what are the contexts for doing business? What do they expect to see in the way of childcare, of schools, etc. They want to also have some conversational language training, as I've mentioned a few times already, just to so that they get around the country more easily. And they want to consider additional training after the arrival, right? And so again, language training, cultural exposure, and host country support. So that they want to make sure that they have someone in that country who can connect with them, maybe from their host country or that consultant who's been training them. So you want to make sure that they, after they arrive, that when they have questions, they have someone to reach out to. Foreign jobs assignments. So we'd like to talk a little bit here about what they call the glass border. And this is unseen but strong discriminatory barrier blocking many women from international assignments. And this talks about results and issues of development and knowledge for higher level jobs, because that's something that we haven't really spoken about yet, but having an expatriate assignment really gives you a leg up when you come back to your home country. Having that exposure, having that opportunity, giving you that mindset. They have seen that managers who come back, they have a huge opportunity for promotion. And this is also the impact on human capital, right, that we've spoken a lot about, that when women are not included, then they feel that they don't want to stay with the organization, and then we lose a lot of great talent because they are not included. So let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. Foreign nationals are calling. So now this is the second way in creating an opportunity for you to work internationally. So maybe you're not going abroad yourself, but you have someone, an expatriate, coming to you. And so they're going to involve differently these 6 major areas. So they're going to have different values, they're going to have different ways of thinking, different norms, thought patterns, working styles, and decision styles, right? And so we're going to go through these things here deeper in this chapter, but something to be aware of, right? So that someone arrives to your company who's from Russia or from El Salvador, and you need to think of them in a different way, right? You need to connect with them as an individual, and you need to better understand where it is that they're coming from. Cross-cultural working relationships. So now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of what it means to work internationally. So this is a key term when we talk about international business: high and low context cultures. High context cultures use contextual cues to understand people and their communications. They value trust and personal relationships. So this is a really good way to talk about Japan or South Korea, right? And so here is where they really talk about the family and the organization, and that's just so important to them. And then when we talk about low context cultures, this is where we rely on direct questioning to understand people and their communications, and we value efficiency and performance. And this is more familiar to us as Americans. This is also familiar to Germany and a lot of the Western Europe cultures. So you'll hear this a lot, more and more in this course, talking about high and low context cultures. Great. Now we're going to talk about cultural intelligence. Here is where it's an individual's ability to successfully adapt to new culture settings. And then there are 4 components to cultural intelligence. The first is cognitive. This is knowledge about a culture. The second is megacognitive, determining when differences are occurring. Behavioral, ability to generate effective behaviors in a cross-cultural setting. And then motivational, if a person is willing to try and immerse themselves in a particular new culture. Oops, I didn't mean to click onto the next slide here. So let's go back. Let's really dive into these. So the first one is cognitive, right? So this is what we've been talking about so far in this chapter, right? This is knowledge about a particular culture, right? Do you understand if they're low or high contacts? Do you understand that they speak a different language? Do you understand that maybe they give you their business card with two hands like they do in Japan, and you're supposed to accept it with two hands and look closely at the business card as opposed to just grabbing the business card as we do here in the US and sticking it in our pocket for later. So just being aware of these things. Megacognitive is determining when differences are occurring. So this is really becoming someone who's proficient in a global mindset, that you can see, I can see that my colleague is having a misunderstanding with my other colleague because he's being too direct. The colleague is from Japan and he really needs to think about this situation before he comes up with a decision. But my first colleague is American and they want a decision made right away. I need to go in, I need to mediate potentially. I need to speak to each of them about the different cultures, or I need to come to some sort of negotiation as to how they can come up with a solution. And then behavioral, right? This is the ability to generate effective behaviors in a cross-cultural setting. So this is where you really become a pro in watching these situations and becoming that manager in facilitating these things where people are disagreeing. And the last piece, as I mentioned, is motivational. So this is if you in France and you feel that your French is not very good, but you're going to try to speak a little bit of French anyway. And this comes back to confidence and, just being able to try to immerse yourself in a particular culture. Now we're going to talk about 3 different types of firms when it comes to international participation. The first one is the smallest one. These are multi-domestic firms. And this is where they truly tailor their products for various countries, and most of the power goes to the particular region. So this is why when you go to India, for example, you'll see ketchup that is totally different than what we have in the US. Their ketchup there is a whole lot sweeter, and it comes in a different bottle, and Heinz ketchup is completely a different product. Unilever does this because they find that to be the most efficient way for them to work, that they really want to particularly work directly in that country. And this is great because very often the products are particularly closely tailored to the customs and likes of that particular country. But where you lose out is that you can't have shared resources across a region. You can't use their marketing, you can't use their R&D, research and development. You have to have all that local in your particular country. The next one is a global firm. Oops. So a global firm here is moving standardized products from the host country into the country abroad. And Microsoft is a great example here. So using Microsoft Word in the US is just like you're using Microsoft Word in India. Okay, great. And then we're going to talk about transnational firms. This is trying to achieve both. So you get a balance. It's not the simplest thing, I have to say, from experience, right? You're constantly going back and forth as to whether we should use the local or the one from the host country, or from the country that originated the product. And so Ogilvy and Mather is an example that they give in the book. It's an advertising agency. And so they try and create the strategies here in the US and implement those strategies abroad. But then when they actually implement the advertising campaign for a particular product, they will most likely depend more on a local team to implement that. So it's not a simple thing to do, but it's definitely possible. Dimensions of national culture. So here we're going to talk about some of the key points of what this means. So, okay, great. So the first one we're going to talk about is uncertainty avoidance. And I just want to give credit here to the first 4 dimensions of national culture, right? The first 4 are from the traditional study by Hofstede, and you'll hear his name again and again. He's a Dutch social scientist who came up with these initial 4 dimensions of national culture. And he was able to identify where people might necessarily agree when it comes to working internationally. So uncertainty avoidance here is that they don't want to have a lot of risk, right? They don't want to end up with a solution that could potentially fail. And the example that they give here in the book, right, is Germany. So they definitely want to make sure that they have a solution that is going to work. And I think of this when I worked in Switzerland, that I had colleagues that would spend a lot of time making sure that the solution was correct. Uh, Growing up in the United States, our uncertainty avoidance is also high, but it's lower. And so, because Switzerland has a culture that's similar to Germany, I saw that colleagues were spending a lot of time on making sure that the solution was going to be 100% foolproof. The next one is that we're going to talk about here is power distance, right? And this is where there's a clear hierarchy between people. So there's a president and he has 4 or 5 people that he manages, and then they each have 4 or 5 people that they manage, and those associates don't necessarily talk to the president, and only those associates will talk to each other and potentially their manager. So this is a very clear hierarchy. The countries that don't have a hierarchy, because we do here in the US for the most part, Denmark has very low hierarchy. That's where the organizational chart is very flat for the most part. People, or you can think of it as flat in that people can talk amongst each other. The lowest associate can go and talk to the president, etc. There's not a lot of some people might call it bureaucracy, but it's more the power distance as to who communicates with who. Individualism is a big one too, right? This is where the goals of the individual are more important than the goals of the group overall. And we saw this in our book already, where the German associate felt like she didn't want to talk about her personal things at work, because she felt that the things that stay at work, and the things that stay at home stay at home. And so Germany is high in individualism. They think that, the goals of their individual person are most important. Companies that are not individualistic are organization are countries like India and China, right? They're much more interested in the goals of the organization or the goals of the family. Assertiveness, right? So this is also called masculinity sometimes. Hofstede called this masculinity at the time, and they've rephrased it to assertiveness. So this is very popular in the US. We're more direct, we'll tell you exactly what we think. But in Asian cultures, that's not necessarily the case, right? They don't want to ruffle any feathers. They will not necessarily always tell you. And so it's hard because sometimes you're trying to get information out of them in a meeting, but they are not necessarily totally upfront. But it's just their culture, it's just their way of communicating. And now we're going to talk about these last 5 that have been added on to these dimensions after Hofstede did his research. The first one is in-group collectivism, and this is having a lot of pride in your group. So, so not necessarily in the group overall, like the organization and the group overall, but your particular team or your particular group. And again, this is really high in China and in India. Then we have gender egalitarianism. And this is where men or women are given particular power. In Sweden, women are given almost equally as much power as men, or given opportunities. There's a huge opportunity for women to go back to work after they've had a child. They're supported to do that. There are great childcare centers. They're also given a year of time off, included in the healthcare system, and their husbands too are given a year of time off so that the women can go back to work. So this gender and egalitarianism is something to consider as well when you're working abroad. Future orientation. This is long-term planning. Do the people in your organization, do they think about the future, or are they just more concerned about tomorrow? So this is also a dimension of national culture. And Sweden is very high in this also because I see that because the Swedes will often book their vacations a year or two in advance. And you think like, how can they even know where they want to go on vacation? But they do. They plan it, they book it, they tell everyone at work that they're going on vacation, etc. They're just very future oriented. Performance orientation. So this is reward, about talking about rewards and improvement. So this is where a person is very driven by the next promotion, the next reward that they could get, climbing the corporate ladder. And here in the US, that is part of our culture and something that we want to be achieving for always, but not necessarily abroad, right? Sometimes people are just happy to kind of stay in their own position. They're happy with their situation. They're happy with their family. Their particular culture has not instilled in them a drive to perform better and better, which is fine. Again, it's just something to understand. And the last one is humane orientation, right? This is otherwise known as altruism. The Philippines is very into this. So if you go to work and your colleague in the Philippines starts to talk about how they were volunteering over the weekend with saving the seals or working at their local church, this is really important to them. This is something that gives them a lot of gratification, a lot of feedback. And you know, the Philippines is a Catholic country, so there's something tied to that as well. They're very religious. So if you find it strange that someone's talking to you about how they volunteered over the weekend, maybe understand that potentially they have a high degree for humane orientation. And here are different countries and how they rate in these national cultures, right? So we have these different cultural dimensions here on the left, and then each of these countries is rated high and low. So, right, for example, I was saying individualism, Germany is very high, right? They really talk a lot about the person as individual. They don't like to necessarily share, even at work, what it is that they do on the weekends, because they think of themselves as being an individual who has a personal life, and that doesn't make sense to share that with your colleagues. But the United States, actually, we're medium. We do a balance of both. And India, too, they do a balance of both, right? And but Germany, on the other hand, is very low in humane orientation, right? They're not so interested in understanding what you do for your volunteerism and helping the culture in general, right? But India, for example, is like the Philippines, very high in humane orientation. So the next three slides go into how can I use all of this information, right? Where does this come up in the daily workplace? And so there are three different examples. We won't go through all three in detail because there's so much to know, but there's going to be talk about first information sharing here, then we're going to talk about decision power and individual autonomy, and then decision making and self-managing teams. So three basic principles that we've spoken about in this book, what it means to be a manager, and how does this whole cultural thing affect that. So let's start here first with information sharing, and we'll talk about high versus low uncertainty avoidance, right? So to remind ourselves, right, high uncertainty avoidance means that we always want to have the information to provide a direction. And we talked about Germany being very high with this. They don't want to have many risks in their decisions, right? But low uncertainty avoidance means that they're okay with less information and that they're more interested in wanting new ideas. And this is a situation that is common in India, for example, right? They don't necessarily need all of the information, but they want to kind of just relax, I'd say, and be laid back as to coming up with new, fresh, or artistic ideas, right? So when we go into information sharing, this is important to know, right? Because a manager from Germany is going to want to know all of the information right away so that he or she can make that decision. But a manager from India is going to be okay not having that all. Actually, he or she doesn't even want that information. They want to they get overwhelmed potentially with all that information. They are going to be able to make their decision when they come up with new ideas that come into this conversation. And then to move here into high or low assertiveness, let's talk about information sharing when it pertains to this. So high assertiveness is, again, the US, right? We want direct information. Again, this is what they sometimes call masculinity. But low assertiveness, this is where we increase the teamwork. And again, we're talking about India. So that when we talk about information sharing, which we need for decision making, that again, the US manager is going to want direct information, but the Indian manager is going to want to make sure that the whole team is involved in making a decision. So something to think about. And again, I won't go through all of these things, individualistic versus collectivistic, and low power versus high power distance when it comes to information sharing, but you get the idea. So these 3 slides kind of walk you through how we would implement all these ideas and identify where those cultural norms come into play. Good. So again, as I spoke about decision power and individual autonomy, and decision power and self-managing teams. So the last 2 slides here have to do with ethics. A big portion also of international business, right? Because when we go abroad, ethics are not necessarily the same in different countries. This happens most likely when it comes to bribes. So you might go to Africa and it's common for you to bribe the inspector for your construction project because that's just how business is done. That's the only way that you're going to get the approval for your construction project, potentially in some African countries. But as an American manager, is that something that you want to be involved with? So it's really interesting to look at what truly is the right decision, right? And so another thing to think about also when you come down to ethics is contracts. That here in the West, contracts are very standard, but in the East, people can be insulted if you hand them a contract. It's all about teamwork and hopefully I said that correctly. So it's in the West that we value contracts, but in the East, like in Brazil, for example, that if you hand somebody a contract, they might be frustrated that they think we shook hands, we're friends. Why would you ever not do what it is that we promised you to do? Or we wouldn't, of course, do something that we promised you to do. So you just need to be careful about whether or not you want to hand someone a contract or if that is accepted in that particular country. So international ethics here is defined as principles of proper conduct focused on issues such as corruption, exploitation of labor, and environmental impact. So there are 3 different places where ethics come into place. Corruption is the biggest one. So that's why I talked about the bribes and the contracts. But exploitation of labor obviously is a big one too, right? That we can use cheaper labor abroad and not necessarily pay the people the value of what it is that they're providing. And then also environmental impact, right? So making sure that the emissions from our factory in China are agreeing with what the global standards are. So let's hop into the next slide, is absence of corruption ranking. Because again, the book says that corruption is really the biggest thing that you're going to be needing to address when we go to work internationally. And so this is also a misuse of power for private gain, right? When we come down to corruption, and they have 5 countries that have almost limited no corruption, and then 5 countries that have a lot of corruption. And why this is also a problem is that for those 5 countries that are in the bottom 5, they're really going to suffer because they're going to have a lack of economic development. Because foreign investors are not necessarily going to want to invest in those countries because they're not necessarily confident that those investment dollars will see any profit. It's going to be very unclear as to how things work in that country, and we're not going to be able to follow up. So if you bribe someone in Somalia, for example, and then they don't approve your construction project, how are you actually going to follow up and say, I paid you the bribe, right? But my construction project still isn't done. So really important to consider as we go into a world of international management, and also know that in these bottom 5 countries, potentially the only investment money that they might get is money from other countries that are corrupt, right? So, for example, North Korea has a ton of investment from China because China is also a communist country. And is that really the right way? Is that helping North Korea coming to develop their country into, well, they're very far from coming out of communism at this stage, but is that really helping their people in the big picture? So really something to consider. The nice thing is that we do have a lot of countries that are not corrupt, right? Denmark, New Zealand, Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, great places to invest. But you also notice that multinationals are heavily in those or interested in being in those countries. So to invest in those countries can be somewhat competitive. Concludes our slides here for this chapter on working in an international environment and globalization, chapter 3 from our book. Again, I'm Professor Green, and thank you so much for joining us.